Have you ever heard of a story where the person who was supposed to be the solution ended up being the problem? Well, today we're diving into the incredible, chaotic story of a man's election was meant to heal the church, but instead ripped it in two. Let's get into the tragic reign of Pope Urban VI.
I mean, this is the central mystery, right? We're talking about one of the biggest crises in the history of the church, the Great Western Schism. And it all boils down to this one question. How on earth did the choice of a single pope, a man everyone thought was a reformer, lead to a division that literally fractured Europe for decades?
And this is what it looked like. For almost 40 years, it wasn't a matter of one pope. There were two. Sometimes there were even three. You had the pope in Rome, our guy Urban VI, and then you had a rival pope set up in Avignon, France, Clement VII. And believe me, this was not just some theological squabble. It was a political earthquake. Every king, every queen, every kingdom in Europe had to pick a side.
Okay, so to really get how this all went so wrong, we have to go back to Rome in the year 1378. The city was basically a powder keg, and the cardinals, well, they were about to light the fuse.
So here's the setup. For about 70 years, the popes hadn't even been living in Rome. They were in Avignon, France. So the papacy had just moved back when Pope Gregory XI dies, and the people of Rome are terrified. They're convinced that the cardinals, most of whom are French, are just going to elect another Frenchman and pack up and leave again, and they were absolutely not going to let that happen.
You can just imagine the scene. This chant, "We want a Roman," or at least an Italian, was roaring all around the conclave. Thousands of angry Romans were swarming St. Peter's Square. The cardinals are trapped inside, hearing the city's bells tolling, hearing the crowds shouting. The pressure was unbelievable. It was terrifying.
So what do you do when you're cornered like that? Who do you pick? Well, their solution was a man that honestly, nobody really saw coming.
They landed on this guy, Bartholomew Prignano. He was the Archbishop of Bari. And get this, he wasn't even a cardinal. That's a huge deal. In fact, he's the last person ever to be elected pope from outside the College of Cardinals. But he was Italian, so that would satisfy the mob. And he had this reputation for being a humble, honest, super efficient administrator. He seemed like the perfect, safe choice. A good compromise.
I mean, this quote from one of the cardinals tells you everything you need to know about their state of mind. They were genuinely afraid for their lives. So under this intense pressure, they unanimously elected Prignano, who took the name Urban VI. And for a brief, shining moment, it seemed like the crisis was over.
Yeah? That moment of relief? It didn't last. The crisis hadn't been avoided. It had just begun. Because the humble, quiet administrator the cardinals thought they elected was not the pope they got. His transformation was as sudden as it was catastrophic.
And at first, he did exactly what everyone hoped he would. He came out swinging. He immediately started attacking the cardinals for their fancy lifestyles, told them they couldn't take money from kings anymore, and swore he was going to stamp out corruption. And, most importantly, he made it crystal clear the papacy was staying in Rome, period.
But, and this is a huge but, his methods were just brutal. He wasn't a gentle reformer, he was a tyrant. People who knew him said that the power had, and I quote, completely turned his head. He became arrogant, erratic, with a volcanic temper. He would publicly yell at and humiliate the very men who had just elected him. They thought they were getting a puppet, someone they could control. What they got was a dictator.
Now, it's not like everyone abandoned him. He had some very powerful supporters, like the famous mystic Catherine of Siena. She became his fiercest defender. To her, Urban was God's chosen man for the job, and the cardinals who turned against him were, in her words, devils in human form. She saw this as a clear-cut battle between good and evil.
But Urban's harsh, alienating behavior basically handed his enemies the perfect excuse they needed to act. His tyranny was about to directly trigger the split that would break Christendom.
And here's the playbook they followed. Step 1, the French cardinals, feeling insulted and threatened, slip out of Rome. Step 2, they issue a public declaration saying, hey, that election of Urban, it doesn't count. We were forced into it by the mob. Step 3, they gathered together under the protection of the French king. And finally, step 4, they elect one of their own, a guy named Robert of Geneva, as their pope. He takes the name Clement VII. And just like that, the schism is real.
And boom, the fallout was immediate. Europe split right down the middle, mostly along existing political lines. It was pretty predictable, really. France and its allies, like Scotland and Castile, they sided with their French pope in Avignon. And, of course, France's great enemy, England, sided with Urban in Rome, as did the Holy Roman Empire. So now you've got two Catholic churches, two sets of cardinals, and two men both claiming to be the one true pope.
If you thought things were bad already, well, they were about to get a whole lot darker. The schism didn't just divide the church. It sent Urban's papacies spiraling into constant war, paranoia, and acts of just shocking brutality.
Urban's reign from here on out is just a whirlwind of political backstabbing and brutal vengeance. He gets involved in the politics of Naples, which completely backfires, and he ends up being betrayed and basically imprisoned by the very king he put on the throne. And that betrayal seems to have pushed his paranoia completely over the edge, leading him to do something truly horrifying to his own inner circle.
I mean, can you just picture this for a second? While he's trapped in this fortress, besieged by his enemies, he doesn't cower. No, Urban gets up, goes to a window 3 or 4 times a day, and with all the official ceremony, bell, book, and burning candle, he solemnly excommunicates the soldiers down below. It was an act of pure theatrical defiance.
But this was the point of no return. While he was besieged, Urban supposedly uncovered a plot among his own cardinals to have him declared insane and unfit to rule. His revenge was monstrous. He had 6 of them arrested and horribly tortured. 5 were later executed. Some reports say they were tied up in sacks and just thrown into the sea. A chronicler at the time called it a crime unheard of through the centuries. That's how shocking it was, even back then.
Urban himself died in 1389, apparently after falling from his mule. But the fire that he started, it just kept on burning. His successors in Rome and the rival popes in Avignon carried on the fight. The Western Schism, the massive wound that he tore open in the church, would last for 40 long years. It wasn't finally resolved until 1417.
So at the end of the day, we're left with this puzzle, aren't we? Who was Urban VI really? Was he a truly righteous reformer, maybe a little heavy-handed, who was just undone by corrupt enemies looking for an excuse to rebel? Or was he a man whose mind was fundamentally broken by the sudden crushing weight of absolute power? The answer, just like the man himself, remains one of history's great, tragic puzzles.